Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another special episode of Access World Podcast, a production of the American Foundation for the Blind on all things digital inclusion and accessibility. I'm your co-host, Tony Stevens, with the American Foundation for the Blind, and I'm joined here by our fellow co-host and editor-in-chief of Access World, Mr. Aaron Priest. Hey, Aaron, how's it going?
Not too bad, Tony. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic, man. This is an exciting episode. We're not only doing this over our traditional podcast feed that drops on the first of every month, but we're also excited that this video for a very special presentation will also be posted on our YouTube channel. So hi, everybody checking us out on YouTube right now. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more updates like this and also get a chance to subscribe to the Access World podcast if you have not already done that. So, Mr. Aaron, there's been a lot going on in the worlds of digital inclusion and accessibility. I know you, as editor-in-chief at Access World, really keep in touch with a lot of this stuff. But we're excited to bring on two special guests today who are going to be experts on the subject we're talking about, because there's been a lot of news in this space for the past month. And we are excited to welcome two folks from the Public Policy and Research Institute at the American Foundation for the Blind. First, we've got Stephanie Inyart, the Chief Public Policy and Research Officer with AFB. Hello, Stephanie. How are you today in Virginia?
I'm great, thanks.
Awesome. And we've also got Sarah Miller, who's our Senior Advisor for Public Policy and Research, working all the time in Washington, D.C. Hello, Sarah. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited that both of you can be here today for our podcast and for our vodcast, our video cast as well. There is a lot going on in the space, even breaking news as we speak. Now, this podcast episode is going to be focusing on Title II regulations that were final rules passed this past month in April for the Americans with Disability Act, dealing with web accessibility and app, something we'll be talking a little bit about how we've been waiting for a long time for that. But literally, as we're recording this podcast, there's other breaking news and stuff as well. Sarah, you're on the ground in Washington, D.C. and always up at the Hill and working with the administration, along Stephanie with you as well. But Sarah, give us a little sense too for a preview of what we'll probably be talking in other episodes, probably even a special edition later this month. Title II got a lot of news, but there's stuff that literally broke this week as well. Tell us a little bit more about the digital accessibility world as it regards to the administration and things going on this week as well.
Right. There's a lot of rulemaking that's been happening, and we're seeing a lot of rules come out as the first term of the Biden administration starts to come to an end. And with that, we've actually got a lot of health and human services related rules. So the Department of Health and Human Services is putting out a rulemaking on Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which requires accessibility from recipients of federal funding. And then we've also got a long-awaited rule covering Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. So a lot of people know that as Obamacare, and that's a rulemaking on non-discrimination on a bunch of characteristics, but including disability. And it also has some web and app and other information communications technology pieces in it as well.
We know, like, whenever there's any sort of rulemaking and regulation that's released by the federal government, it comes in hundreds and hundreds of pages. There's no real cliff notes often that are, thrown in our laps. And I know you're diving through those. And as we get into those rules more and you all are able to understand them best and how they're going to impact our community, we'll be looking forward to touching base later this month. One area that you have been able to really focus in on that was dropped back in April is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the landmark legislation passed in 1990, as many people know. But there weren't a lot of things around back then dealing with where we are today with technology. And, there's Title II of the Americans with Disability Act, and the Department of Justice released this past month their final rule for web and app accessibility guidelines and regulations tied to that in Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We want to take this whole episode today to just really focus in on that because it's such a major piece of regulation changes that are taking place. But tell us, Stephanie, why is this a priority right now for us at AFB? Why is this such a big deal that we're so excited about this rule coming out this past month?
Well, AFB has really made digital inclusion issues and specifically a lot of advocacy around the Title II rule such a priority because coming out of the pandemic, so many things went into a far more digital space where we had the ability to interface with a lot of people in a frontline capacity to be able to handle all kinds of tasks in life or in work. So many things went into using an app for that. And there's an app for that, and there's an app for everything now. And websites became the storefront and the first place that people would touch when they're trying to accomplish a task. So when web and app spaces really, moved into a higher, prevalence for our daily interactions, their accessibility became essential. And this space is widely inaccessible for people who are blind and have low vision and people who are deafblind, as well as for people with a lot of other different kinds of disabilities, like those who are deaf, those with manual dexterity issues, some in the epilepsy space, etc. And so there's parts of the disability community that really began to try to dialogue and push for something that would address this shift into the digital age that we made very rapidly in COVID. We did a lot of research at AFB as well that really documented the kind of prevalence of these barriers, the way that these barriers interfaced with people's experiences in an educational environment, in the workplace, in terms of their daily independence and other kinds of tasks in life. And that research as well as a lot of the other work that AFB has done in the digital inclusion space really pushed us to advocate, very, very much for a strong Title II rule. And we also knew that this rule was not the only rule that the Biden administration was working on that touched websites and apps and accessibility, and that there would be some interconnectedness between kind of a series of rules that we're now seeing coming out. Not to foreshadow what we may talk about in the future, but that this rule would be a lead rule in establishing a regulation or a public rulemaking on this topic.
Yeah, and if I can jump in with a couple of the really compelling statistics that AFB has come up with in our research. Like Stephanie mentioned, we have done a series of studies, and one of our most recent ones is the Barriers to Digital Inclusion study, where we asked folks who are blind, have low vision, or deafblind, what their the barriers that they faced with websites and apps. And we had 148 individuals who reported using websites to access public benefits, and only 25% of them reported that they did not have accessibility barriers. So that means the other 75% are experiencing either frequent or occasional barriers with accessing public benefits. Similarly, we know that there are some issues with accessing transit information. For example, 30% of the 159 respondents who used websites to look up local transit information reported that they experienced frequent barriers, and only 31 of those, that's about 20%, reported that they did not experience any barriers. And what was so great about that research was that it didn't just tell where people had barriers, it also it talked about the consequences. So we had 77% of the respondents saying that they experience frustration when they can't complete tasks independently online, and 45% feel socially excluded. 60% reported that they need to wait to get help from a sighted person. There's privacy and data security implications, with 55% reporting that they experience a loss of privacy when websites and apps are inaccessible. 80% report that it takes them longer to complete tasks. And then this is really important, 65% report that they either miss information or they can't complete tasks altogether when websites or apps are inaccessible. And the ADA is really built around making sure that people with disabilities have equal opportunity and equal access, independence, and experience these same levels of privacy and timeliness that everyone else gets to experience when using websites. So this research was really instrumental to kind of motivating and informing the work that we've been doing.
So as Tony mentioned, the ADA has been around since 1990, which will be, I believe, 34 years as of later this summer. So what does a rulemaking now like this mean, and what will this change? How will it change what the organizations covered by the ADA and Title II, what will it change about how they have to operate or what they have to do?
So this question is a great one from the standpoint that, we've certainly had to live through decades without a regulation that provides a lot of this clarity for an entity that it's pointed at, a state or a local entity. But we're in a landscape now where we've had the federal government go beyond where they've been before. Before this point, about 14 years ago, there was the beginning of a rulemaking that was started in the Obama administration. And that was something that started around 14 years ago, and then it was, kind of taken off of the docket, so to speak, later on. And we're in this spot where people had to interpret the application of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but they could claim that technically without the regulations, they don't have the clarity to require them to do something very specific. You had the Department of Justice pointing to using the WCAG standard in court cases, but they didn't have a rule that literally said you must actually follow WCAG. Well, now that's what we have today. Is we have had the Americans with Disabilities Act for several decades, and we've had courts interpret it. We've had the Department of Justice provide us guidance as well. We've also had the Department of Justice rule in cases that a particular standard should be applied, but they never went so far as walking through a public rulemaking. And for those that don't know what a public rulemaking is they provide a proposed rule, Department of Justice in this case, and they outline what they would want to put in the regulation. And then they have a public comment period where for about 2 months, anyone in the public, whether you're a company, whether you're someone that will be impacted by the regulation, whether you're an advocate, anyone can go ahead and weigh in and say what they think of the entire proposal. And then the Department of Justice has to take all of this input from the public and they have to actually respond to it. So when they see that there's a lot of commenters that are telling them this is really horrible and this will impact the community in a really negative way, then they actually have to then write a written response that's available for all of us to look at. And so during this public rulemaking process, AFB was very, very, very active in not only providing our own comment from the organization about how this would impact the blind and low vision and deafblind community, but we also went and organized in the cross disability space. And we helped bring together with the partnership of some major coalitions and a lot of organizations a comment that was posted that had 264 organizations sign on to it and back it. And it was a bit of a force in the rule that we see today, because when you look at the way that the Department of Justice had to go through and digest all of this public information from people commenting, you can see that in a lot of circumstances, when they're saying, writing their responses, well, people commented on this, and this is what we have to say about that. In many, many, many cases, it was the disability advocates that were giving the fodder that strengthened this rule and made it a better rule than it was when they put it out a couple of months ago. So we're now at a spot where they have announced and posted this final rule. And it's a rule that I think that the disability community can really be quite pleased with, actually, because the footprint of our advocacy is definitely embedded in what the contents of the rule are. So it's an exciting moment.
It definitely sounds like they were listening, which is fantastic. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Sarah, the barriers to digital inclusion survey that AFB did. That was even referenced in the rationale for the rule, which was exciting to see that the voices and advocacy around the cross disability community was listened to by the administration. Sarah, I know you're in the weeds more than this than anyone I can think of in terms of really diving into the rulemaking and the changes. What's the overall gist? So what does this rule be pushing forward, and like what's the timeline that local and state entities have to deal with? Tell us a little bit about what actually is in this rulemaking.
So the core of this rule, and it's actually not a very long rule when you pull out the text from the 300-page final rule document, the regulatory text is pretty short and sweet. And the operative part of it is that the websites and mobile apps that public entities, and that's state and local governments and some other affiliated entities. So all of these websites and mobile apps that they either create or that they enter into a contract to use, that they have some arrangement to use, it has to comply with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 level AA standard. This is a standard that is pretty widely used. It is an international standard produced by the World Wide Web Consortium. It gets a lot of input from industry and non-industry folks who are experts in digital accessibility. And it's not the most recent standard. We had actually pushed for the 2.2 standard, but because it wasn't formally adopted as a standard until after the rulemaking process was well underway, then we didn't win on that part. But it's still great that the department has told entities that they have to meet a specific standard. And this will do everything from making, directing entities to add alt text to images and videos, to making sure that the headings are appropriate so that people can navigate, setting some standards for contrast for people with low vision. It has to do a little bit with kind of how the layout of a website changes, particularly if you're going from a desktop to a mobile version, and all of these things that are beneficial, not just for people who are blind, but also people who are deaf and people who have manual dexterity disabilities, as Stephanie mentioned earlier. And drilling down a little bit more, I think it might be useful for listeners to hear that, like, this doesn't just apply to the website that a state or local government or a school or whoever is creating themselves. It also is when they purchase an online tool that they're using with the public. If they are, let's say they're using a parking app to allow people to buy parking. This is normally a function that city governments do. But this app company comes up with this great tool, they sell it to the company, they've entered into that contract. So now that app has to be accessible. Another place that I think we're going to see this a lot is in public schools and public universities and public colleges, when they enter into an agreement to have a classroom learning management system, something like Blackboard or Google Classroom. They're going to have to put some accessibility requirements into it, and that tool is going to have to meet the WCAG 2.1 standard. And so this is really important that they've put this contract language in there to make sure that it applies to kind of the breadth of apps and websites that entities are using.
Well, And you bring up some good, Aaron and I were talking beforehand about, one of the big questions we have is who does this apply for? Who does this actually, impact? And you mentioned like, the parking and schools and other things like that. And that's a question that I think are a lot of people's minds. But you're making me think of another question too, though, about, you talked about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and what we call WCAG. And, these guidelines have been around for a while. Why do we need this rule? Why, aren't folks already doing this in a sense?
So obviously, because WCAG has existed for quite a while and has had, different iterations, different chapters that have evolved over time, everybody can, of course, design with WCAG standard of the day in mind. And, you could see kind of a lineage of different court cases that were brought over the years, over the decades, related to, how does the internet, how does the website need to be accessible? And courts did say, WCAG is a standard to implement and use here. The Department of Justice intervened and of course also weighed in many of these instances. But until they actually issue the regulation like they have now, there isn't that regulatory clarity, which is like a buzzword, but it means that there is an actual standard that they have identified. There are details of how to comply with the law that they've identified in this rule, and it's patently clear now exactly what the department is trying to get us to understand is the requirement for websites and apps for this part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is state and local entities. And before this, you had, jurisprudence from courts and guidance, but you could be in a space of saying, well, there's not really a regulation, so maybe I don't necessarily, have to, do X or Y. I mean, this is unequivocally clear now. This is the standard for these entities to be able to meet their requirement under the law, and so that's why this is. It's definitely some concrete forward movement to have that kind of clarity. It's only for state and local entities in terms of the way that, the ADA is structured. So, you have different titles or parts of the ADA. So it's not that Title I, which covers employers, is distinct from this portion, which is Title II and addresses state and local entities, and Title III, which of course addresses places of public accommodation. So they haven't regulated on Title III or Title I with some kind of gray area that we can talk about in another podcast related to the other rules. But the Title II is where they have, created that clarity for a state or local entity.
So it seems like this is a pretty comprehensive rule and it's going to cover a lot of things. What specifically does it not cover, or what exceptions are there to the rule?
Yeah, so there are some exceptions that they've laid out. I said that websites have to adhere to the WCAG standard, but not in all cases. So the Department of Justice wanted to balance some of the interests where, we as disability advocates really want everything to be accessible, because we want people to have equal access in every part of life and all the time. But, the ADA sets out this kind of compromise between businesses and individuals that, yes, you have to have access, but this should not be overly burdensome on entities. It should not be unachievable. So the department tried to identify a few areas in which they thought that the access issues wouldn't be as significant, but then it also, there are areas where entities might spend an inordinate amount of resources trying to make their websites accessible. For the most part, I would say their general goal was to look at things where the future of websites and apps are going to be accessible, but what exists now is going to kind of it be in a transition phase. So we see that there are exemptions for archived web content. So they've said that this is unmodified material that's created before the compliance date. And just to be clear on that, the compliance date is actually 2 years or 3 years from now, depending on the size of the entity. So in 2026 or 2027, depending on the entity, the content created after that point would have to be accessible, but the content created before would not have to be accessible. So archived web content is unmodified content that is created before the compliance date, that is used for research, record keeping, or reference. And they specifically name that this is kind of where you might digitize physical media like paper documents or old video recordings. So if you've got a box of papers from the 70s that a Department of Agriculture has, and they put that up on their website, then that is considered probably archived web content. That's one example that the Department of Justice gives.
What do you? Oh, go ahead. No, finish the other exception, please.
Yeah. So the second exception is for pre-existing conventional electronic documents, and this is a very specific list of documents. So PDFs, word processing documents, spreadsheets, presentation files, as long as they are not used to apply for or gain access to a program or service. Third is content posted on a public entity's website by a third party, unless the public entity has an arrangement with that third party. So this might cover something like a comment board, maybe something that's a submission of public comments to on a rulemaking that a state or local government's making. The fourth exception is for personalized individual or personalized documents that are specific to an individual or their property. So that might be utility bills or PDFs of your patient information that's stored in a health record. And then pre-existing social media posts that were created prior to the compliance date. So those are the 5 exceptions. And then there's also a couple of other limitations that they offer as well for entities.
What are your feelings on, and Stephanie, you as well, like what are your feelings on these exceptions? Are they reasonable? What is your own take on that?
I mean, go ahead, Stephanie.
I mean, AFB, as well as the broader disability community, we opposed all of these exceptions, and we also opposed the exceptions that I think we did successfully advocate for their removal. So, in terms of, I think the most egregious exceptions that they came up with, we advocated very hard and really did have a win there. So I think that they hurt us on the exceptions that were taken out that had to do with both the public school system for K through 12 education, as well as in the higher education space and in some third party space. But so I'm pleased that we did make some really good advocacy results. But we did oppose all of them.
Yeah, I think I would agree. We certainly didn't want any exceptions. I do think that in general, the department, they weighed what they had to do. They could not, or they did not think that they could side with us on everything. But I thought that they were pretty thoughtful in thinking about what is it going to take to make the future of the internet more accessible. And I think the social media content is a great example of that. That anything after the compliance date is going to have to be accessible. It's going to have alt text. It's going to have captions, and where appropriate, it's going to have audio description. But then they don't have to go back on the last 20 years of their social media site to remediate all of that content to bring it up to the WCAG standard. So I think this is a really important step forward.
So you mentioned one of the potential areas where people would see exceptions is something like they're like utility statements and something like that. So that's somewhere people might actually encounter these exceptions kind of out in the world. Or who do you think is going to be most likely to encounter these exceptions or encounter barriers because of the exceptions?
Right. I think that's a great point, Aaron. I think one of the exceptions that I'm most concerned about is that individualized documents exception, because it's going to put the burden on individuals. Every individual with a disability who finds these documents inaccessible is now going to have to go through the individual process for requesting action or requesting access from whoever's providing it. And I think that's going to be really problematic in a utility setting or a public hospital or, to some degree at public universities. I think these are places where we're really going to see that. So I expect everyone's going to encounter one of these exceptions at some point, unfortunately. But on the other hand, there are going to be some people who encounter these exceptions more than other people. So think about somebody who's wants to be a history professor and is blind, trying to go through a digitized archive that is hosted by a public university, perhaps. If that archive is deemed to be exempted from the rule under the archived web content exception, that means it's going to be really hard to go through those archives. It's going to make it harder for people with disabilities to go through genealogical research. Maybe homeowners who want to look up deeds and old maps and records that are paper for their home that was built 100 years ago, and, personally, I have to say it's going to impact us a little bit because, it means that public comments that people put into public rulemakings, aren't required to be accessible from the get-go. So there are definitely going to be some ways that people encounter these exceptions.
Well, I mean, understanding that there are, with the exception of those who get the exemptions or the exceptions, it's a lot of exceptions in one sentence there. What is, for folks that are going to have to follow this rule, this I could see, some examples where it is a lot of work. The expectation is that they have to do this 100% of the time, right? There's not like a threshold or something like that, like 80% or 30% needs to be done. I mean, it's all or none with this, right?
Yeah, exactly. They said that all the content that isn't specifically accepted has to be made accessible 100% of the time. And they paired this, the WCAG standard, which is very specific, with a provision that we have actually been advocating for quite a long time with the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act, and adopted basically what we've been calling a functional definition of accessibility. So they've said if non-compliance with the standard has such a minimal effect on access that it doesn't impact a person with a disability using the website with the same timeliness, privacy, independence, and ease of use, then that's not something, then the entity is still considered to be in compliance with the law. And this is a recognition that WCAG there are 50 success criteria, and that's a lot of content. And sometimes when it says that you have to make your contrast 4.5 to 1 on everything that is on all text, there's a recognition that sometimes it's going to be 4.3, and people still have that functional level of access, but it may not technically comply with the WCAG standard. So that's something that we were excited to see as a result of our advocacy, but also we think it makes the rule reasonable and something that is it is a nod to the challenges of complying with a rule and regulation across the board like this.
And there's a little subtext there too, because this concept of the functional definition is something that we did lean in on the Department of Justice to understand, and that we were pushing for legislatively as well. But as we described it to them and tried to show how useful this could be as a concept, they were very much listening carefully enough to even make, I would say, an improvement on the way that we were describing it in our own terms. The word timeliness is something that they actually called out specifically as they began to understand the real difficulty of using a screen reader in an environment where there's some sort of kind of partial level of accessibility, where the usability is questionable. I might, as a screen reader user, be able to do something that may take a sighted person 5 minutes to do, but it might take me 16 minutes to do that because of all of the extra steps that I have to do with my screen reader to get to that same place. And so they called out that timeliness factor, which I think is a lovely improvement. And it, for me at least, it showed how closely they were really paying attention to what the experiences of people with disabilities actually were when they were, weaving this in. So
yeah, sounds like they're understanding the usability side of things versus just the black and white accessibility side of things.
mm-hmm.
So going forward, it seems like it's great that WCAG in particular is being used for this, since if anybody's messed with it, they know that it's a incredibly thorough set of documentation and has code examples and explanations for every rule and that sort of thing. So great place to start if people are looking to kind of get ahead of things and start working on implementing accessibility. If someone is interested in learning and beginning their training on accessibility, where else can they go, or what other resources might be out there for them to learn about learn about accessibility and usability and learn what they need to do to comply with this rule?
Yeah, I think this is that's a great question, because there are a lot of entities that have policies already that accessibility is required, but there's still a long way to go for state and local governments and all of the transit agencies, and especially in rural communities and smaller towns, to really get up to speed with what they need to do. And as you mentioned, the World Wide Web Consortium has put out a fair amount of guidance to pair with the standard, because they really do want people to be able to understand it and comply with it. The Department of Justice has said that they will be putting out a small entity compliance guidance document. I think we expect to see that in the next couple of months. And so I think that'll be really important for some of the small entities to kind of get a head start and to understand how this rule applies to them. And likewise, the Department of Justice runs an ADA information line that does help entities understand the rule. But one, I think, vastly underused or known resource is the ADA National Network. So if you're part of a covered entity, if you're part of a school or a university or a small town, whatever you might be, you can call the ADA National Network or email them or reach out in other ways and ask them questions. It's confidential, it's free, and they can get you started in understanding both what you have to do and kind of, push you in that right direction of like, how do you actually comply with the rules. And they have an accessible technology series of webinars as well. So that's a great resource that entities can look at. We know
I'm sure they're going to put out quite a bit of helpful content as well. So I would watch that space for more, I'm sure.
Yeah, the ADA network definitely hands down an excellent resource for people. For state and local governments, for sure. As we're wrapping things up, like, what does this mean for everyone else beyond local and state governments? Like, what does, I guess this doesn't impact them directly, but what does this mean for the rest of the world when it comes to digital inclusion and accessibility?
I think that this is the beginning, I believe, of there being, unequivocal, clear direction as to what is meant by making a website or an app accessible. And so when there have been areas of major differences in interpretation as to what that actually means, or if it means something specific, that's where a lot of court cases kind of went. I think that it's very clear what the Department of Justice has articulated for a state or a local entity. And while that's only part of what is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think that it is essentially the building block for where other regulations and other rules have gone, because I know that there are other rules that mirror aspects of this that we mentioned earlier in this podcast. But I believe that places of public accommodation, which is Title III, is an area that we really do need to see a clear rule on. But I can't imagine that we would be in a spot where Department of Justice would create something that looks radically different than what we see here with Title II. So if I was, let's say, not necessarily a state or local entity, and I wanted to prepare for the future, I would begin to look carefully at the way that people are called to meet their obligations. And I would look carefully at WCAG and the standard and begin to prepare myself, because I believe there will be more and more spaces that will essentially kind of align with this level of access that's required.
So to piggyback real quick off of what Tony asked, and I think we might have covered this earlier. This covers public and local entities. If you are a company that is working with an entity, say, I think Sarah mentioned Blackboard earlier, or like Classroom Technology, even though those are, say, private companies, would they be affected by this rule because they are in business with, like if they wanted to do business with a local school system or a public university, would they have to comply with this rule?
Yes, but it's in a little bit of a roundabout way. And the ADA really applies to it has what we term covered entities. So in this case, the state and local governments, the public universities, the water utilities, the transit agencies. That's the covered entity. They are required to make sure that their websites and apps that they're using, including those that they get through a contract. So, all of the apps that they buy from other private businesses, those have to be accessible. And they're the ones who will be held accountable. And so, if you are a private business, I mean, you might say, oh, well, it doesn't actually apply to me, but it certainly is going to apply to your sales. The intention here is that the only sales that will go through in the future are for accessible products, because now the covered entity has to buy products that are accessible. So I think that's really kind of the mechanism through which those private businesses become covered. It's really through the contracts that they are making with public entities.
Makes sense. So financial
be,
versus illegal.
Yeah.
There will be whole sectors that this will be a massive shift for. So like if you create educational technology apps that are sold in packages to school districts, that whole sector, this is a disruptor for that whole sector, because essentially the public schools are going to be required to only buy accessible apps. And that means that if you aren't creating an accessible app, yours is not going to be the one that they're going to be relying on, because it's massive liability for them. So what this does is in this space of the marketplace and educational tech apps, it totally shifts it to be, okay, now everyone's creating accessible. And that's just like one piece of this puzzle where, there's a whole bunch of private companies that are going to have to be, very well versed in delivering in this space. So it will disrupt in a lot of spaces.
And if I can jump in and add, part of the reason why there is this compliance time period is in part to give those entities times to rework their contracts. I think if you're a public entity, you really need to be looking at what contracts do you have? Can you change them now? Or can you change them within the next 2 years, so that they are going to comply with this regulation?
So in thinking of like a couple years down the road, and Stephanie, you mentioned a little earlier about, kind of alluding to Title III of the ADA and private sector. I mean, what's next for AFB, the broader community, in terms of, all things digital inclusion and accessibility for public policy?
Well, I want to show real gratitude for the administration that brought together this Title II rule, because I know that it was many, many years in the making, and they had to have it remain such a high priority to get it to come to fruition. So that being said, as a hardcore advocate, I think that our next hope and terrain will truly be to get a Title III regulation that also really listens to the struggles of the disability community as it is shaped, because there are, really egregious problems in that landscape. And so from that standpoint, Title III is something that is desperately needed. And it's my hope that everybody is thinking about that now that we're sitting with Title II in our hands. I know that there is a lot of terrain as well related to the way that the Americans with Disabilities Act kind of it doesn't address the creation issue of websites and apps. And so many entities, we've described it in this podcast, they're relying on some other entity to create the web or app that they're buying and using and contracting for. And so the Website and Software Applications Accessibility Act is a space where we have articulated that really the requirement for accessible building needs to extend to the people or the entities that create these things, to the vendors that small governments and major companies and everybody is relying on to create a website or an app, or kind of a drag and drop system where you're plugging things in from like a prefab program. And we do need to get to a place where, like the Website and Software Applications Accessibility Act states, that vendors are also held liable for building inaccessibly. So I think that that's another kind of thing to tackle that will really get at like the root of a lot of the problems that the disability community faces with accessibility. Because if we can get to a spot where we're changing the way that stuff is being built or what's available for people to rely on as accessible in the marketplace, then a lot of this becomes almost moot. Because if the marketplace is accessible and everyone's able to buy and rely on accessibility, that is just a huge game changer for small and big entities of all types. So those aspects of the frontier are spaces that we'll continue to pay attention to.
An exciting frontier ahead for sure. Again, hats off to you and Sarah for the wonderful work you all have been doing, and in terms of as well the broader disability community. We want folks to know that there is a wonderful post that Sarah has penned or typed or whatever we say in blog speak nowadays on the AFB blog. You can check that out. We'll have that in the show notes and video link notes as well here in this posting. But be sure to check that out. It really breaks down in greater detail in terms of the rule itself as it's changing. We're going to be coming back again in a month or so, or maybe even sooner, around the Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is we're in May now. Oh, I can't believe it's May. May 16th is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We've also got AccessWorld coming up in a few weeks around that same time, right, Aaron?
Yeah, AccessWorld will drop on it's the Tuesday after Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So I believe it's the 21st or 22nd.
So be sure to check out that latest issue of AccessWorld as it comes online. And, you know, we want to thank everybody for being a part of us here today as we break down Title II of the ADA. Again, so many things going on, so exciting, but so much work behind the scenes. So congrats to all the folks working behind the scenes to get us over the finish line for this rule for Title II. Everyone, thanks so much for checking out Access World, a podcast of the American Foundation for the Blind. You want to learn more about Access World, go to www.afb.org/AW for Access World, or you can just check us out at afb.org for all the other work we're doing and the great public policy and research work. That Blind Digital Inclusion Survey that Sarah was mentioning earlier is on our website. And, you know, for everybody else out there, do well. And thanks again for checking us out today. And let's keep accessibility alive. Thanks.